Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be continuing my watercolor series. This is going to be part 2. I'm going to be talking all about paper, teaching you about what it's made out of and how to choose a paper that's going to work really well for the type of painting that you do. Before I continue on with the video, I just want to say I'm sorry this has taken so long to get out. I had actually filmed all of the parts in one go and I was just rambling a bunch and it was really hard to edit, so I decided it was just going to be easier to actually refilm the whole video. So that's what I'm doing today and hopefully you enjoy it. So continuing on, I'm going to start talking about paper. All paper is going to be made from a type of pulp. Most paper is going to be made from cellulose, which is wood pulp. However, when you get into artist quality papers, you're also going to have a cotton or a linen rag. And most artist papers are going to be part cellulose, part rag. When you get into the higher end, you can get paper that is all rag. And really, this just kind of depends on your personal preference. Papers that are going to be more, have a higher rag count, you know, if they're pure cotton, linen, rag, they're going to hold up to water a lot better, and they're not going to disintegrate as easily, whereas like the cheaper papers may disintegrate a lot easier. Like, you know, when you're if you try to paint on cheap paper like computer paper, it starts like dissolving. That's because it's like all cellulose. So the higher quality paper that you get, the more rag that it has in it, the less likely that is to happen. So that's really good. I personally like really cottony feeling papers. I like my paper to feel more like fabric than paper. So, but that's just personal preference. Well, there's a couple different things that watercolor paper has that are things you should take into consideration. So the first is going to be the weight of the paper. The second is going to be how well sized the paper is, whether it's hard sized or soft sized. And then the third thing is going to be whether the paper, like how the paper is pressed, whether it's hot press, cold press, rough, extra rough. And then your final consideration, well actually this should be your first consideration, is whether you want it loose or in a sketchbook. So I'm going to kind of go over all of those things. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the weight of the paper. So the most common weights you're going to find are 90 pound, 140 pound, and 300 pound. And basically what the weight of watercolor paper is the manufacturer is going to take a ream of 500 sheets of paper, of uncut paper, and they're going to weigh that. And that indicates the number of that indicates the weight of the paper. So 500 sheets weighs 90 pounds, it's 90 pounds. Pretty simple. Generally, when it comes to watercolor paper, the heavier paper is going to be thicker. Makes sense. So 300 pound paper is thicker than 140 pound paper, which is thicker than 90 pound paper. The most commonly used is going to be 140 pound. You don't really need to use 300 pound unless you're getting crazy with the water. I think 140 pound is generally sufficient, and 90 is really not sufficient enough. They're good for sketches, it's good for sketching, light washes, really simple stuff, but personally I would stay for paperweights. Most stuff I feel is personal preference, but for paperweights I would really stay around 140. It's a lot more cost effective. It's usually only a couple dollars more than 90 pound, and the quality difference is substantial, but 300 pound is usually significantly more expensive. So there you go. Moving on from weight, you want to look at the size of the paper. Now, I'm not talking about size like 9 by 10, 8 by 5, whatever. I'm talking about watercolor size, and what that is it's basically gelatin, and things can be internally or externally sized. And what this does is it's either mixed into the paper or painted on the top of the paper. That's what internal versus external is. Most watercolor papers actually have both internal and external sizing, and you can actually size your own paper if it's not sized. And what it does is it stops the water from sinking into paper immediately, because if you don't size paper, it's basically just like toilet paper or you know, kitchen roll, like so you need to size it, or else you're just going to put some paint on there, and before you're able to splatter it around, it's just going to like right into the paper. So you want to make sure that your paper is sized. If you buy some like raw paper and the paint sinks into it, you can size your own paper. I'm not going to go into that, but just Google it. And when you're looking at papers, there are differences between how they're sized. There is hard sized and what is commonly referred to as soft sized paper. And basically it just means the amount of size they have on them. Hard sized has a lot of size and soft sized doesn't have as much. And this is really gonna be down to the technique that you use. Hard size paper is really good if you are the kind of person that likes to do a lot of lifting in your watercolor paint, and lifting is when you take the paint off the paper with a wet paintbrush or something else. It's going to lift off really, really easily because the surface is it's not sticking to the surface or absorbing into the surface as much because there's so much size on it. So if you are a lifter, then you should go with a hard size paper like an Arche. Arche brand is pretty hard sized. If, however, you are like me and you paint in lots of thin transparent layers, you're gonna want at least a softer sized paper. The reason being is that hard size paper, because they do lift so well, it's really, really hard to actually get more than a couple layers of paint on top of there. I know that I have tried working with a hard size paper before, and it was so frustrating because every time I tried to put a layer of paint on top, it would pull off the layer of paint underneath. So I personally prefer a soft size paper, but I work in layers and I don't lift very often. If you lift a lot and you don't really add too many layers, you're kind of painting flat areas of color, then a hard size paper would probably be really, really good for you. So after your size, you're going to want to look at the press of the paper. And I'm trying to talk slow because I know I talk really fast. I'm sorry. So there are 4 common kind of like paper textures, I guess. It's hot press, cold press, rough, and extra rough. So in order of smoothest to roughest, hot press, cold press, rough, extra rough. So your hot press paper is been pressed with heat and it smooths it out, and it's really, really like a really kind of, you know, a lot of watercolor paper has texture on it. This is going to have the least amount of texture. It's going to be really nice and smooth. Hot press paper is great if you really like detail, especially if you're getting a lot of pen detail in. A lot of people that use watercolor for botanical illustrations like hot press paper. It's really good for that. You're also going to get a more uniform color because there's not as many like divots for it to sink into. So hot press paper is really good for that. If you prefer rougher paper, you have the 3 options of cold press, rough, extra rough. Cold press is basically your default watercolor paper. It's got some texture to it, but it's not crazy. And then obviously, as you go higher in the roughness scale, the texture is going to build. I personally like rough to extra rough paper. The advantages of using a rougher paper are you're going to get a really nice granulation. Granulation is where the pigment sinks into the divots in the paper, and it creates a really beautiful mottled effect. You can also, watercolor for me personally, I really like the texture of it, and I find it's a lot nicer to work with. However, you can't get as detailed with it. A good compromise if you do like detail but you want some of that texture and granulation is a cold press paper, and I do primarily work in cold press paper simply because it's easiest to get in the store. So the last thing I'm going to cover is loose paper versus working in a sketchbook, and there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So if you're going to work loose, the advantages are it's really great for finished pieces. You can frame it, you don't have to worry about cutting it out of a sketchbook. Sometimes when you're working in a sketchbook, the paint can kind of like run to the divots in the sketchbook, and the paper can wrinkle in sketchbooks. When you're working loose, you can kind of tape that paper down. You can do that in sketchbooks, it's just a little bit harder. So if you want to tape the paper down, you can do that so you get a more neat edge and things stay flatter. You can iron the piece once you're done. It's just a lot better for creating finished work, working looses. Also, you get a lot more control over the type of paper that you want. When you're buying a sketchbook, there's not too much variation out there in the types of paper. So if you really like heavy paper, you're not going to find a sketchbook with that in it unless you bind it yourself. So if you're very particular about your paper, you want to do finished works, I would definitely recommend working loose. However, sketchbooks are great. There are a lot of good watercolor sketchbooks out there now. They've really come a long way. I still feel like there's more work to be done, but from when I was younger, there's so many more options, which is great. Sketchbooks are amazing for working plein air, carrying with you, taking around, all of that good stuff, that sketchbooks are usually used for, are also good with watercolor sketchbooks. It's a little bit harder to paint plein air without a sketchbook unless you have a little setup with like an easel and you can tape everything down. So sketchbooks are also good if you want like a nice little book or collection of your work. They're good for, little quick things, studies, that kind of stuff. So sketchbooks are good and they are useful, and I would definitely recommend working in both of them. For sketchbooks, if you are interested, I do have 2 recommendations. The first is going to be the Moleskine watercolor sketchbooks. The Moleskine regular paper will take watercolor, however, it is a pain in the butt. Like, I can't just... it's really hard. The Moleskine regular paper is so hard sized, like it like repels paint, and you can do it, but like you need to soak the whole paper in water before you do it. Just yeah. So the Moleskine watercolor paper is pretty good. This is their large one, but they sell it in, they also have like the regular size ones. It's decently thick, and it's gonna be kind of, it's cold press, but it is on the smoother side. So it's got a little bit of texture, but not too much. You're not gonna be able to see the texture, but this is how big it is when you kind of open it out. Hello. And yeah, it's a decently thick paper. It's a good one. I like it. However, that is actually not my favorite watercolor sketchbook. My favorite watercolor sketchbook is by Strathmore, and it looks like this. I don't know if I just like them because they're dark brown and pretty and look all like fancy, but I actually do prefer the paper in this. The paper in these sketchbooks is thicker, and it has slightly more of a texture to it, and it definitely feels higher quality watercolor paper. So this is just a really nice thick watercolor paper. You could work in this, and then you could cut the paper out and use it as a finished piece if you wanted. And this is, the reason this is such good quality is because this is their 400 series watercolor paper, and it's actually made by an art company, whereas Moleskine is a great brand. They make amazing books, but they're not technically an art company. Strathmore is an art paper company, and they do great watercolor papers, great cost-effective watercolor papers, and I would highly recommend them, and I would highly recommend this sketchbook. On that note, for recommendations on loose watercolor papers, as I said, I would highly recommend Strathmore. I think they're great. They're super, super cost effective. You can find them at just about any like craft store, and most craft stores also have like 40% off coupons that you can use too to bring the cost down. I would recommend their 300 series or higher. Their 300 series, I believe, is the one that comes in the yellow packet, and then the 400 is the one that comes in the brown. The 400 is artist quality, and it's really good. 400 is awesome if you can afford it. Otherwise, the 300 is also great. And like I said, they're decently priced. Outside of that, there's a couple other brands that I would recommend. The first is going to be Arche. I personally do not like Arche paper. However, that's because it's really hard sized. It is really good paper. People love it. If you like creating really, really detailed illustrations, you want a nice like hot press paper. They also have great cold press paper too, but their paper is really, really good if you want a hard sized paper. So I would recommend those. They are quite expensive. There are a couple other papers. The Fabriano Artistico is super good. It's about 50% cotton, and the one that I have is in rough, and it's really, really a great cost-effective option if you like linen rag papers. So highly recommend that. And then the last two that I'm going to recommend are going to be a little bit harder to find, and that's going to be Bee paper and Buckingford. And you may have to look online for these. Bee paper is the bomb. You can get it on Amazon. It's 100% cotton. It's got a lovely texture to it. Oh, it's one of the best watercolor papers I've ever worked on. I just have a really small pack of it because my mom got it for me, but you can buy them on Amazon. They are reasonably priced, but you do tend to have to buy in big batches, so then it can kind of cost more up front. But per piece of paper, it's pretty reasonable, I think, but you can pretty much only find them online. And the second one is Buckingford paper. I personally don't use Buckingford paper, but my mother does, and she does highly recommend it as well. And that's a great paper, and it's again on the higher end range. So if you're looking for cheap, cost-effective options, I would definitely look at the Fabriano or the Strathmore. If you're looking for something a little bit more upscale, the Arche or the Buckingford. And if you want something that's good, decently cost-effective, but you have to go online to get it, go get the Bee paper. So yeah, that is it. I made it through the video, and thanks so much for watching. Have a absolutely wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye! Blah!